On the morning of October 24th, 79 AD, 20,000 people woke up in one of the most prosperous cities in the Roman Empire. They did not know it was their last morning. To truly understand what was lost that day and what was miraculously saved, you first need to understand what Pompeii was. Not the ruin, not the cautionary tale, the living, breathing, extraordinary city that existed before the mountain took it. Pompeii sat at the heart of the Bay of Naples, in the richest agricultural region of the Roman world. The volcanic soil surrounding the city was extraordinarily fertile. Wheat, olives, grapes, all growing in abundance on the slopes of the very mountain that would destroy everything. The city's location on the coast made it a natural trading hub. Ships arrived daily from across the Mediterranean, bringing silk from the east, grain from Egypt, tin from Britain. 20,000 people called Pompeii home. That number puts it in context. In the Roman world, this was a significant city. Not Rome, which had over 1 million inhabitants, but not a provincial backwater either. Pompeii had all the infrastructure of a proper Roman metropolis. It had a 20,000-seat amphitheater, one of the oldest and largest in the Roman world, built a century before the Colosseum in Rome. Gladiatorial games were held there regularly, attracting visitors from across the region. It had a large theater for dramatic performances, a smaller theater for musical events, 3 public bath complexes open to citizens of every social class, a forum surrounded by temples and civic buildings, an elaborate system of stepping stones allowing pedestrians to cross the frequently flooded streets without soiling their sandals, and over 30 restaurants, the Romans called them thermopolia, where workers could grab a hot meal between shifts. The streets were lined with political graffiti. Archaeologists have found over 11,000 inscriptions painted on Pompeii's walls. Election endorsements, insults, declarations of love, advertisements for upcoming gladiatorial matches. The walls of Pompeii were its social media. They tell us that the city was alive, opinionated, and deeply engaged with the everyday politics of Roman life. One inscription reads, "Vote for Lucius Popedius Ampliatus for aedile. He's a good man." Another, less charitable, says, "I'm amazed, O wall, that you have not fallen in ruins when you carry on your shoulders the tedious writings of so many scribblers." Even 2,000 years ago, people complained about graffiti. Behind the city, rising to 4,000 feet, stood Mount Vesuvius, and the people of Pompeii did not fear it. Why would they? The mountain had not erupted in over 900 years. To the Romans living in its shadow, Vesuvius was not a threat. It was a provider. The volcanic soil on its slopes was the source of the region's extraordinary agricultural wealth. Farmers had worked those fields for uncounted generations. Vineyards climbed the mountain's sides, producing wine that was exported across the empire. The Romans worshipped Vesuvius as a deity, a benevolent giant who made the land rich. They had no concept of what lay beneath, no understanding of tectonic plates, of magma chambers, of the geological forces that had been building pressure beneath their feet for nearly a millennium. The Roman world had no word for volcano. That term would only be coined centuries later, named after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, in reference to the island of Volcano in the Sicilian seas. But the warning signs were there, for those who knew how to read them. In 62 AD, 17 years before the eruption, a devastating earthquake had struck the Bay of Naples. Pompeii had been severely damaged. Buildings had collapsed. The water supply had been disrupted. The city had spent years rebuilding, and when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, some repairs were still ongoing. The earthquake of 62 AD was, we now know, directly caused by volcanic activity beneath the mountain. Magma pushing upward, destabilizing the rock above. In the weeks before the eruption, the warning signs intensified. Minor tremors were felt daily, so frequently that the inhabitants had become accustomed to them and barely noticed. Wells that had been reliable for generations dried up without explanation. The underground water table disrupted by rising magma. The water in the Bay of Naples took on a strange, sulfurous smell. Fish were found dead on beaches. Dogs refused to enter certain districts of the city, their more sensitive senses detecting something their human owners could not. And 4 days before the eruption, the tremors became more frequent. Not more violent, just more frequent. Constant small shudders, like the mountain clearing its throat. Nobody left. This is not unusual. This is human nature. We are creatures of habit and routine. We stay in the places we know, surrounded by the things we have built, until the evidence of danger becomes so overwhelming that we can no longer deny it. The Romans of Pompeii had survived earthquakes before. They had rebuilt before. They expected to rebuild again. They were wrong. October 24th, 79 AD. A Tuesday, according to Roman calendar calculations. The morning was described by Pliny the Younger, a 17-year-old boy staying with his mother and uncle in Misenum, across the Bay of Naples 18 miles from Vesuvius, as entirely normal. The sky was clear. The bay was calm. There was nothing in the morning air to suggest that this day would be different from any other. In Pompeii, the day began as it always did. Bakers had been at work since before dawn. Archaeologists have found bread still in the ovens at Pompeii, preserved by the very eruption that killed its baker. Merchants were opening their shops along the Via dell'Abbondanza, the city's main commercial street. The Forum was filling with citizens conducting business, settling legal disputes, making political deals. At the baths, the furnaces were being stoked for the day's first visitors. At the amphitheater, workers were preparing the arena for an upcoming event. In the wealthy houses on the hill above the Forum, slaves were preparing breakfast for their masters. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the Romans' universal condiment. Olives, bread, perhaps some fruit. Life was proceeding normally. Life was good. Then, at approximately 1 in the afternoon, everything changed. The eruption of Vesuvius on October 24th, 79 AD, was not a gradual buildup. It was instantaneous and total. A thick layer of hardened lava had been sealing the volcanic crater, trapping gases that had been building pressure for nearly 1,000 years. When that seal finally gave way, the release was catastrophic. An enormous column of volcanic ash, pumice, and superheated gas blasted 30 kilometers, nearly 19 miles, straight up into the stratosphere. Every second, 1.5 million tons of volcanic debris were ejected into the atmosphere. In total, the eruption released over 100,000 times more thermal energy than both atomic bombs dropped on Japan combined. Pliny the Younger, watching from 18 miles away across the bay, described what he saw in a letter written years later to the historian Tacitus. The eruption cloud, he wrote, rose to a great height on a sort of trunk, then split off into branches, resembling, he said, a great umbrella pine tree. His description is so precise that modern volcanologists use the term Plinian eruption to describe this exact type of volcanic event, named after the 17-year-old boy who watched and took notes. In Pompeii, the column of ash and debris rose so high that it blocked out the sun. The city went from bright afternoon to near total darkness in a matter of minutes. The temperature dropped suddenly, and then the ash fall began. For the first several hours after the eruption began, Pompeii was not immediately lethal. The ashfall was heavy and frightening, but it was survivable. Pumice stones, lightweight porous rocks ejected by the volcano, rained down on the city like a surreal gray hail. Some were the size of a fist. People covered their heads with pillows and cushions. Pliny the Younger describes this in his account, and ran for the gates. This is the moment that determined who would live and who would die. The eruption gave Pompeii something that most volcanic disasters do not provide: time. In those first critical hours, the roads leading away from the city were still passable. The gates were open. Escape was possible for those willing to abandon everything and run. Archaeological evidence tells us what happened next, and it is more hopeful than the popular image of Pompeii as a city of death. Studies estimate that the total population of Pompeii on the day of the eruption was between 15 and 20,000 people. The remains of approximately 2,000 people have been found in the ruins, roughly 10 to 13% of the population. That means that somewhere between 80 and 90% of Pompeii's inhabitants escaped. 16,000 survivors. 16,000 people who looked at that dark column rising above the mountain, made the decision to leave, and ran. How do we know this? Beyond the body count, archaeologists have found compelling physical evidence. Houses where all the most valuable items, jewelry, gold coins, official documents, are missing. The owners grabbed what mattered most and fled. In other houses, family silver and gold are still exactly where they were left, in cupboards and under floorboards. Those families had been planning to come back. They never did. Archaeologists have also found the bodies of people who died on the roads outside the city, clearly in the act of fleeing. And they have found people who died inside the city, not on the roads, not near the gates, but in their homes, in the baths, in the forum. People who, for whatever reason, chose to stay. This question has fascinated historians for centuries. Why did anyone stay? Some stayed because they genuinely believed it would pass. The Romans had no concept of a supervolcano. They had experienced earthquakes before and rebuilt. Perhaps this, too, would end. Perhaps the mountain would quiet down, the ash would stop, and they would emerge to find their city damaged but standing. This was not irrational thinking given what they knew. It was simply wrong. Some stayed because they were physically unable to leave. The elderly, the sick, the very young. For them, running through streets filling with ash while pumice stones rained from the sky was not an option. We have found the remains of families huddled together in corners of rooms, clearly sheltering in place, hoping for survival that never came. Some stayed because they were enslaved. Slaves in the Roman world could not leave without their master's permission. Archaeological excavations have found the remains of people still in chains, people who wanted to flee and were physically prevented from doing so. This detail, perhaps more than any other, captures the full horror of what happened in Pompeii. Not just the volcanic eruption, but the human systems that made survival impossible for some, even when escape was theoretically available. And some stayed to protect their possessions. The famous House of the Gold Bracelet at Pompeii takes its name from the extraordinary gold bracelet found on the arm of a woman who died there, along with her children and servants. She had not fled. Archaeological analysis suggests she may have been waiting, hoping the ashfall would ease, planning to leave when it became safer. She waited too long. While 20,000 people were fleeing Pompeii, one man was sailing directly toward the volcano. His name was Gaius Plinius Secundus. History remembers him as Pliny the Elder, the uncle of Pliny the Younger, whose letters are our primary source for everything we know about the eruption. He was 55 years old, significantly overweight by his own nephew's account, and one of the greatest scientific minds of the ancient world. Pliny the Elder was the commander of the Roman fleet stationed at Misenum. He was also the author of the Naturalis Historia, a 37-volume encyclopedia attempting to document everything known about the natural world. He was a man of insatiable curiosity who had spent his entire life observing, recording, and attempting to understand the natural phenomena around him. When Vesuvius erupted, Pliny the Elder did what any great scientist would do. He called for his boat. His initial intention was purely scientific. He wanted a closer look at the eruption column. But before he could cast off, a messenger arrived from the coast near the volcano. It was a letter from a woman named Rectina, the wife of a friend, who was trapped at her villa at the base of the mountain with no means of escape by road. She was begging for rescue by sea. Pliny immediately changed his plans. He transformed his single scientific vessel into a rescue fleet, ordering several large warships to accompany him across the bay toward the eruption. His nephew, who wanted to come, was refused. This was too dangerous for a teenager, his uncle said. He left young Pliny at Misenum and set sail into the darkening sea. The journey across the Bay of Naples that afternoon was extraordinary. Pliny the Younger, writing from his nephew's later account to Tacitus, describes what his uncle's fleet encountered. Pumice stones and ash were falling from the sky. Floating rafts of pumice, ejected from the volcano, light enough to float, were beginning to cover the surface of the bay, making navigation increasingly difficult. As the fleet drew closer to the volcano, the ashfall intensified. Stones were bombarding the ships. The sea was being churned by underwater tremors. The sky had turned completely black. Pliny's helmsman urged him to turn back. The admiral refused. He reportedly told his helmsman, as they sailed through the shower of ash and pumice, "Fortune favors the brave." Then he dictated notes about the eruption to a secretary. Even sailing into a volcanic disaster, he could not stop observing and recording. He made it across the bay, though not to Rectina's villa. The shoreline there was already blocked by debris. Instead, he landed at Stabii, a small resort town south of Pompeii, where he found his friend Pomponianus in a state of panic. Pomponianus had loaded his ships with his possessions and was desperate to leave, but the wind and waves made departure impossible. Pliny, remarkably, chose to calm everyone down. He bathed. He ate dinner. He went to sleep. He was either extraordinarily calm under pressure, or he simply could not physically run. His weight and age made him poorly suited for flight. Either way, he slept through the night as the eruption continued around him. In the early hours of October 25th, as the pyroclastic surges began descending from Vesuvius, the situation at Stabii became untenable. The buildings were shaking so violently that remaining indoors was as dangerous as going outside. Pliny and his companions went out to the shore. The scene they encountered was apocalyptic. The sea was wild and unnavigable. The sky was completely black. Volcanic lightning, a phenomenon caused by electrical charges building up in the eruption column, was providing the only intermittent light. The smell of sulfur was overwhelming. Pliny asked his two slaves to help him stand. He had been lying on a sheet on the beach. Then he collapsed. His nephew believed he had been suffocated by the toxic gases, sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide, that accompanied the pyroclastic surges. His body was found on the beach days later, when the air had finally cleared. He was lying fully clothed, his body intact and uninjured, looking, Pliny the Younger wrote, more like a man asleep than dead. He was the greatest naturalist of the ancient world, and he died in service of his two greatest passions, scientific curiosity and human compassion. He had sailed toward the disaster to observe it and to save lives. He saved some. He gave his own. Pliny the Younger survived. He had stayed at Misenum, and when the pyroclastic surges reached even that distance, 18 miles from the volcano, he fled with his mother through the ash-darkened countryside. His account of that flight, written years later to Tacitus, is one of the most vivid and devastating pieces of eyewitness writing in history. The ground trembling underfoot, the sky black as night at midday, people praying in the streets, convinced the world was ending, and young Pliny, terrified but present of mind, noting everything he saw, preserving for us the only surviving account of one of history's greatest disasters. For the first 12 hours after the eruption, the volcanic column had been held aloft by the enormous pressure of the gases pushing it upward. But geological forces are not indefinite. By midnight, the eruption column, 30 kilometers of ash, gas, and rock, had become too heavy for the gases beneath it to support. It collapsed. When the column fell, it did not simply dump its contents onto the ground. It created something far more lethal than ashfall: pyroclastic density currents, also called pyroclastic surges. These are avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and rock that flow down the slopes of a volcano at speeds that can exceed 400 kilometers per hour, over 250 miles per hour. Their temperatures range from 300 to 800 degrees Celsius. Nothing alive can survive a pyroclastic surge, not in its path, not sheltering in a building, not hiding in a basement. The surge penetrates every opening. The heat alone kills instantly, not burning, not suffocating, but a form of thermal shock so extreme that death is effectively instantaneous. The body stops functioning before the brain can register that anything has happened. Herculaneum, the smaller city 3 miles west of Vesuvius, and therefore directly in the path of the first surges, was hit before Pompeii. Hundreds of people who had fled to the boathouses along the harbor, hoping to escape by sea, were killed instantly. Their remains, discovered by archaeologists in the 1980s, showed the characteristic bright red coloration of bodies exposed to extreme heat. Some were curled in the fetal position. Some were seated as if waiting. All had died in a fraction of a second. Over the course of the night and early morning of October 25th, 5 pyroclastic surges descended from Vesuvius. Each one advanced further from the mountain than the last, as the eruption progressively expelled more material and the surges grew in power. The first surge, at approximately midnight, stopped just outside the walls of Pompeii. Those who had remained inside the city were spared for a few more hours. The surge had come from the direction of Herculaneum to the northwest. Pompeii, to the southeast, had been partially shielded by the direction of the initial collapse. The second surge, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, reached the walls of Pompeii. The air temperature outside the city became lethal. Those who had been trying to escape on foot were overtaken. Those inside, sheltering behind walls and under roofs, survived. But then, something cruel happened. As dawn broke on October 25th, the ashfall began to ease. The pyroclastic activity seemed to pause. The air, while still thick with fine ash particles, became slightly more breathable. The light, while still dim and eerie, showed the faint suggestion of morning. Some of those sheltering in Pompeii thought it was over. They were wrong. What they were experiencing was not the end of the eruption. It was a pause between surges, the geological equivalent of a storm catching its breath before its final, most violent attack. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, the fourth pyroclastic surge, the most powerful yet, descended from Vesuvius and entered the city of Pompeii. It moved through the streets at over 200 miles per hour. Its temperature was above 300 degrees Celsius. It penetrated through windows, under doors, down chimneys. It found every person still alive in the city. The plaster casts that have made Pompeii famous tell us what happened in those final seconds. When the surge passed and the ash settled and hardened around the bodies, it preserved not just their physical forms, but their final positions, their final moments frozen in time for 2,000 years. A mother curled around her young child, her body wrapped protectively over the small form beneath her. She knew what was coming. She died trying to shield her child from it. A man lying on his back, one arm flung over his face, as if the gesture of covering his eyes might save him from what was consuming him. Two people in an apparent embrace, whether they were family, lovers, or strangers who found comfort in each other's presence in their final moment, we will never know. A chained dog, still attached to its post, still wearing its decorated collar. A gladiator, apparently fleeing, his weapons left behind. These are not statistics. These are people. Their names were recorded on the walls of their city. Their preferences and prejudices were painted in their graffiti. Their meals were preserved in their kitchens. And their deaths were preserved in the very material that killed them. A fifth surge buried Pompeii completely. 20 feet of volcanic ash and debris. The city fell silent. The countdown had reached 0. History remembers Pompeii as a city of the dead. The plaster casts, the preserved bodies, the frozen moment of catastrophe. But here is what history has largely forgotten. The survivors. Between 80 and 90% of Pompeii's population escaped that day. Somewhere between 16,000 and 18,000 people who had been going about their ordinary lives that Tuesday morning were, by nightfall, refugees, homeless, possessionless, traumatized, but alive. Professor Stephen Tuck of the University of Miami spent years attempting to trace what happened to these survivors. By cross-referencing names found in Pompeii's inscriptions with records from surrounding cities in the decades after 79 AD, he was able to reconstruct, at least partially, the diaspora that followed the eruption. The survivors scattered across the Bay of Naples region and beyond. Most settled in the nearest major cities, Neapolis, which is modern-day Naples, and the smaller centers of Nola, Nuceria, and Puteoli. Some traveled further. Inscriptions bearing Pompeian family names have been found as far away as Rome. They brought everything they were with them: their customs, their religious practices, their food traditions, their social networks, their family names. In Neapolis, archaeologists have found evidence of Pompeian worship practices appearing in the decades after 79 AD. People maintaining the religious traditions of their lost home in their new one. In several cities, buildings were constructed in architectural styles characteristic of Pompeii. Survivors recreating in brick and stone something of the city they had lost. One of the most moving discoveries in Professor Tuck's research was a tombstone found in Neapolis, bearing the word "have." The Oscan word meaning welcome, a greeting characteristic of Pompeii. That same word, spelled identically, appears in mosaic form on the threshold of the House of the Faun in Pompeii, the grandest private residence in the city. A survivor, or their descendant, had placed their hometown's greeting on their family tomb in their new city. a whisper from a world that no longer existed. The Roman Emperor Titus responded to the disaster with genuine concern. He visited the Bay of Naples twice, reportedly visibly moved by the scale of the destruction. He dispatched relief funds and assigned 2 former consuls to oversee the reconstruction of the affected region. Property that had belonged to people who died without heirs was allocated to help survivors rebuild. But the survivors had not waited for imperial assistance. They had already begun rebuilding their lives before the emperor arrived. They had found homes, established businesses, enrolled their children in new schools, made new friends, joined new communities, as survivors always do. Because that is what survival means. Not just escaping the initial disaster, but continuing to live afterward. In the years after the eruption, something remarkable happened. Pompeii disappeared, not just physically, buried under 20 feet of volcanic debris, but from human memory. Within a generation, most people had forgotten that a great city had once existed, where the fields and farms now stood. The Roman name for the area shifted. New roads were built that bypassed the buried city entirely. Farmers plowed their fields over the ruins, occasionally striking a wall or a mosaic, and simply building around it. For 17 centuries, Pompeii lay silent beneath the earth, perfectly preserved. Every fresco undisturbed by time, every piece of bread hardened but intact in ovens that still contained the ash of their last fire. Every inscription still legible on walls that had not seen sunlight since 79 AD. In 1748, a farmer near Naples was digging in his vineyard when his spade struck something solid. Stone, then mosaic, then a painted wall. He had stumbled onto one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history. Excavations began almost immediately. Over the following decades and centuries, Pompeii was gradually revealed, a complete Roman city, frozen in its final moment, giving us the most detailed and intimate view of ancient daily life in existence. Not the life of emperors and generals, but the life of bakers and merchants and slaves and children. The life of ordinary people who woke up one morning not knowing it was their last. Today, Pompeii is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. Nearly 4 million people walk its streets each year, reading the graffiti, looking at the frescoes, standing before the plaster casts. They come to understand what was lost, and perhaps to understand something about what survives. Because 3 million people live in the shadow of Vesuvius today. The volcano is still active. Scientists classify it as one of the most dangerous volcanoes on the planet. Not because of its size, but because of the population density surrounding it. At least 600,000 people live within the direct danger zone. A major eruption today would require the largest civilian evacuation in European history. The Italian government has detailed evacuation plans. Vesuvius is monitored 24 hours a day by a network of seismographs, GPS sensors, and gas analyzers. The lessons of Pompeii have not been forgotten. Look at this image taken from space. Vesuvius at the center, and all around it, a sea of lights, roads, and homes. 3 million people living exactly where the Romans lived, for the same reasons. Because the land is fertile, the sea is close, and life is good here. The mountain sleeps. For now. Ave atque vale, Pompeii. Every catastrophe has a countdown. Every disaster has a 0 hour. The moment when everything changes, when the world divides into before and after. But every countdown also has survivors. The story of Pompeii is not only the story of 20 feet of ash and the 2,000 bodies preserved within it. It is the story of 16,000 people who made a decision to leave, to run, to abandon everything they had built and carry only what mattered most. 16,000 people who were afraid and ran anyway. They had no seismographs, no satellite data, no government emergency alerts on their phones. They had only what every human being has had since the beginning: the capacity to read danger, the will to survive, and the courage to act before it was too late. The mother who died curled around her child. She made a different choice, not necessarily a wrong one, a human one. She stayed because she could not bring herself to abandon her home, or because she waited 1 hour too long, or because she believed the worst was over when the ashfall briefly eased. We cannot judge her. We can only grieve for her. But we can learn from the 16,000 who left. The volcanic soil around Vesuvius is still extraordinarily fertile. The fields are still green, the vineyards still productive, the Bay of Naples still beautiful. 3 million people live there today, in the shadow of the same mountain, for the same reasons the Romans did. Because the land is rich, the sea is close, and life is good. They know what the Romans did not. They know what the mountain is capable of. They have the evacuation plans, the warning systems, the knowledge. Whether that knowledge will be enough, when the time comes, when the tremors increase and the wells dry up and the mountain clears its throat again, that is a question only the future can answer. Every disaster has a countdown. The question is not whether you will hear it. The question is whether you will act in time. If this documentary brought history to life for you, subscribe and leave a comment.